what happened to the old-fashioned liberals that we used to hear about? You know, the Shami Chakrabartis and the Claire Foxes of the world. You know, what happened to them? What happened to their vociferous criticism of all things illiberal? Because you just don't hear about it right now. And I use those two names as placeholders for any others you care to think about. But in those two specific examples, one of the more emblematic things that's happened is they've both got seats in the Lords now. And meanwhile, in the past 15 months, all of the things that Chakrabarti used to complain about have been visited upon the British people. And in fact, in many different countries all over the world this has happened. And critique from Chakrabarti and a ilk is notably absent. So what's happened to all these people? You know, and there are others. So, you know, back in the early 90s when, you know, my band was trying to make it, my fellow band members like to think of themselves as, you know, revolutionaries or rebels and anti-authoritarians. And so they were very impressed by, you know, bands like Rage Against the Machine. Yeah, and you know, the Foo Fighters, or before them, you know, that fucking band that Kurt Cobain was in, and I can't remember what they were called at the moment, Nirvana. You know, all of these guys who were sticking it to the man, you know, and this is very impressive. And what happened to all those people? Well, they've become the establishment, haven't they? You know, their line is now the same as the government line, the major corporations line. All of these people, they're not the resistance anymore. You know, and do you remember the Occupy movement? You know, they stood against corporations. You know, in the way that's characteristic of old-style liberals. You know, but what's happened to them? No, they're standing up, the corporations now. They're insisting that we do what the corporations say. And so is the government. And so is Rage Against the Machine. And as far as we can tell, Chakrabarti is silent on the issue. You know, I remember in the 80s, there was a television ad campaign for Smirnoff. And the ad campaign went something like this. I picture the scene. It's an imperial palace somewhere, and we're invited to believe that this is perhaps Russia at the fag end of the Tsarist period, right? And there are all these guys, there's the Tsar himself, the king, you know, with his courtiers, and there's a big table there, a banquet, and, you know, there are servants bringing in food, and it's like a 5-course dinner. And there's about 12 of them at this table. And and they're sitting there and they're living it up quite a lot. And suddenly, bursting through the door come the revolutionaries. There's a whole bunch of them with their machine guns. And they arrest the aristocrats and take them away. And after all of this, the boss revolutionary is sat there. He puts his rifle down and he sits down, puts his feet up at the head of this table, and he notices all of the nosh. So he pours himself a glass of Smirnoff and starts tucking into this nosh. And it's not long before some counter-revolutionaries burst through the door and arrest him. And then they arrest him, and then the boss counter-revolutionary is there alone in the room, and he notices, you know, the banquet, and he decides to help himself, and so it goes on. Now that was an ad campaign, but I think it told the truth about the way these cycles work. And it also tells you something about revolutionaries themselves. Frank Herbert once said that all revolutionaries are closet aristocrats. And so I'm going to venture to provide an explanation for what's happened to the old-style liberals. They were always closet aristocrats all along. And they cast themselves, back in the days before they had, any access to the levers of power, as people who thought it was dreadfully unfair that these privileges were reserved for just a few people, and how unfair it was that not everybody could avail themselves of those. Until they got to avail themselves of them. And then we got to see the truth of what they really believed, because it wasn't a case that it was dreadfully unfair that nobody could, or not anybody could, enjoy those privileges. What they really thought was unfair was that they couldn't enjoy them. And as soon as they could, well, the rest of us could go hang. And that's what's happened. That's why Chakrabarti and Rage Against the Machine and what remains of Nirvana and Bruce Springsteen and all these other people that cast themselves as being, down-to-earth people, guys you could go and have a beer with, to people who are now telling you, well, no, you've got to follow the government line on this, and you've got to trust the corporations, including the news ones, the pharmaceutical ones. No one's had the nerve to talk about the military-industrial complex yet, but give it time. And I think that's what's happened to them. They were never really interested in liberalism, not old-fashioned liberalism anyway. What they were interested in is grabbing the levers of power. And of course, once they got the chance to do that, a distressingly high proportion of them actually found the temptation irresistible. And one of the things that I think is surprising, and a little bit disappointing if I'm honest, although there are reasons to be optimistic because of this, some of the people on the music scene side of it that I never had any time for musically, some of those have been the strongest voices in favour of liberty. So you have Ian Brown, Stone Roses. I never had any time for them as musicians or players. I'd never have bought any of their albums. Noel Gallagher from Oasis, of all people, seems to still want to stick it to the man, And Oasis is a band that I've never had a good word to say about. But you've got to hand it to at least Noel, who's been pretty vocal on this. Van Morrison is another guy who I didn't hate, but I never paid too much attention to him. He's come out pretty strongly and actually fulfilled the archetype of a rebel. Right said Fred, all this stuff. Meanwhile, all the people I used to like are just completely hopeless on this issue. And, while I say that this is perhaps a cause for optimism, the fact of the matter is the people I lionised have shown themselves to have sort of feet of clay on the important issues. They're complete dunderheads, cowards even. And it's really disappointing. And that includes some of the people I know personally, I've got to say. It's one of the reasons I came off Facebook, simply because, I was just fed up with all the nonsense. And I did actually do a presentation at the time about that, which I didn't post, because there was still a possibility that it might matter. Maybe I'll do that again, or maybe the moment's lost now. But that's my explanation as to what happened to the liberals, Essentially, they were never really liberals. Okay, so long. Thanks for all the fish.